So I'm going to start with our the sponsors, and hopefully the guys that are there. Ted wasn't at davening, so I don't know if he's getting on today, but the others were. So we'll begin with a year of learning. Dr. Paul Koningsberg, in memory of his brother, Dr. Sam Koningsberg, Shimon Reuven ben Levish, and Ed Goldberg's cousin, Nissen Hara Nissen ben Fardosa. Paula and Bob Romberg, in memory of their dear friend Julian Smith. Yehuda ben Yisrael. Malka Mann, in memory of her family murdered in the Holocaust. Harav Tzvi Hirsch ben Shlomo Yaakov, Sarah bat Ephraim, Yisrael David ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Ephraim ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Adia bat Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Miriam bat Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Pesel bat Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shalom ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shlomo Yaakov ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shmuel ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch. Many friends of Dr. Marvin Blush, Moshe Shalom ben Yitzchak Halevi, friends of Toby Paris, Sarah Tova bat Yisrael Dov, friends of Malka Levy, Malka bat Yosef, friends of Avi Gidler, Avrameir ben Shimon, Cheryl Sher, her children and grandchildren, in memory of her uncle, founding member of BRS, Dr. Israel Brook, Yisrael ben Harav Akiva, and Marcia Federbush and family, in memory of her husband, Dr. Uriel Paul Federbush, Uriel ben Harav Shimon. A month of learning, sponsored by Haran and Mal Haller, in memory of her mother, Malka Rachel Bas Yehuda Leib, Adina and Michael Kirshner, in memory of their parents, Florence and Nathan Kirshner, and friend Harriet Friedman, Tova and Leo Zimmer, in memory of her mother, Henya Bas Harav Beryl, and her father, Aaron ben Yosef Mordechai, Perry and Jill Meltzer, in memory of his mother, Malka Bas Baruch, and sister Golda Leah bat David Halevi, Carol and Josh Sanborn, in memory of her father, Yehoshua Shia ben Moshe Yehuda HaKohen, Stanley Presser, in memory of his mother, Leah bat Yehuda, his mother-in-law, Golda Bas Avram, and his wife, Rachel Mincha Bas Moshe. A week of learning, sponsored by Judy Iger, in memory of her mother, Bela bat Anshul Yitzchak, as well as Sherry and Moshe Gross, in memory of her mother, Miriam Bas Meir. Today is the 25th, and it's a day of learning by Eli and Sheila Zimmerman in honor of his father, Alta ben Sion ben Eliyahu Yehuda. Shemas heaven, Crank Rafia, Velti Yeshua Shema Talia, and L'chol B'nai Yisrael, a good Gaban Shtiar.
Amen.
Okay. Okay. All right. So, okay, I'm going to have us start back on the bottom of Samach Dalet Amud Beis. Okay, Marvin? And hopefully the other guys will be getting on shortly. Okay. About 3 lines up from the bottom, okay? Amar Rabbi Elazar, so he says, Atya Zrika Me'ola, okay? At the example of doing Zrika and throwing the blood from there onto the Yesod, okay, is based on the example of the Ola. K'tiv Hacha, because it's written here in one place, Et Damam Tizrok, that their blood, plural, notice for blood, will be sprinkled. Al HaMizbeach. Uktiv Hatam, and then it's written elsewhere there, V'zorku b'nei Aharon, HaKohanim et Damo, Al HaMizbeach Saviv. Okay, so again, indicating that once more, a second time, a reference to Zrika by the Kohanim, its blood. So the Gemara says, Ma'olah te'una yesod, af Pesach nami te'un yesod. So the same way that the blood on the yesod, for the olah, had to be sprinkled on the base, okay? So likewise, the Korban Pesach requires that it be sprinkled on the base, okay? So on the top of Samach Hey, Amud Aleph, today's daf, the Gemara asks the question, V'olah gufa minalan, and on what basis do we know that this is the case regarding the olah? Okay. Amar Kra, says the pasuk, El Yesod Mizbach HaOlah. Okay. So therefore indicating that it's got to be at the Yesod of the base of the Mizbeach. Okay. Alma, therefore, okay, or would it seem to imply, might be a better explanation for Alma, Olah Tu'una Yesod, that the Olah required that its blood be sprinkled on the base of the Mizbeach. Okay. Now, having discussed that, our Gemara is going to go back to the discussion of our Mishnah. Okay, and that's where we pick up really new material today. Okay. Yatzta kat rishona. The Mishnah said that the first group went out. Right? Tana. Okay. So it was taught. He nikret kat atzlanit. This was called the lazy group. Okay. All right. Now, is it really referring to the first one as the lazy group? It's probably really referring to the third group. Remember, we said it had to be 3 groups.
Right.
And the question was there 10 in each group for the total of 30? Or did it mean 30 l'chatchila in each group? Okay. So why would it be called the lazy group? Baha lo sagi de lav hachi. Right, says the Gemara. And in this case, okay, isn't that not the case? Why would they be lazy if they're the first group?
Right.
Mai havilaho l'me'abad. Okay, what should they have done? In other words, those really in the third group. Afilu hachi ibai laho lezruze nafshayu. Even in this case, okay, if they were the first group, okay, it's necessary that they should have made more of an effort on the part of themselves to be earlier. Kidatanya, as taught elsewhere in a Braita, Rebbe Omer, says Rebbe, Efshar le'olam below basam. The world cannot exist without perfumers, uvelo borsai, and without tanners. Now, remember the parallel here is that they both work with liquids that give off odors. On the one hand, the perfumers would grind certain spices, mix it with liquids, and therefore produce their perfumes. The tanners would grind, right, like certain items, mix it with liquids to get their colors, okay, in order to produce dye. The difference is, of course, that for the tanners, the odor was terrible.
Terrible.
Okay? So what happens? Ashrei mi she'amunato basam. Happy is he whose livelihood is that of the perfumer. Oilo mi she'amunato borsai. Woe to him whose craft is the artisans, is the tanners, right? Not only do they deal with the odor, but the dye, excuse me, gets on their clothes as well. V'ef shar la'olam below zecharim u below nekevot, he says. Further, says Rabbi, and it's impossible for the world to exist without males and without females. Okay, However, he adds, Ashrei mi shebanav zcharim, happy is he whose progeny are males. Oy lo mi shebanav nekevot, woe is he whose progeny is females. Okay?
So he's trying to say that the both of them are necessary. The perfume and the tanners are both necessary.
Right. Okay. And but he's saying that it's more difficult to raise daughters than it is to raise sons. That's what I'm going to suggest as his explanation. Okay? Why? Because daughters, you have to worry about marrying them off at the appropriate age and other kinds of things. Okay. Next piece from our Mishnah. Sehu b'chol v'chule. Remember here the Mishnah told us that in general, if the 14th of Nisan came out on Shabbat, that in general the practices associated with the Korban Pesach would be the same. However, it pointed out that there were one or two items by which the sages were not happy. Okay? Namely, shelo b'ratzon man. Okay? One of those was the fact that they allowed for the washing down of the floor of the Azara. Okay? So it said the rabbis were not happy. Who was it? Asks the Gemara that wasn't happy. Amar Rav Chisda, says Rav Chisda, shelo b'ratzon Rabbi Eliezer. It was not satisfied with Rabbi Eliezer. De'i Rabbanan, because if it were the multitude of rabbis, ha'amrei shavut hu, they are the ones who say that it is basically shavut, rabbinic prohibitions. Ve'ein shavut b'mikdash, and there is no application of the rabbinic prohibitions on Shabbat in the Beis HaMikdash. Ma'ihi, asks the Gemara, so what is it? Okay, in other words, what's the parallel here? To Tanya, okay, as we teach in another Braita. Echad hacholev v'hamechabetz v'hamegaben kegrogeret, kegrogerot, okay, hamechabed v'hamarbetz v'harodeh halosh devash. Okay, I'm going to go back now. Bright is going to teach us the same thing applies to one who is cholev, okay, who milks the animal, v'hamechabes, and curdles the milk, v'hamegaven, who makes the cheese as much as a size of a dried fig, right? V'hamechabed, okay, and one who sweeps, v'hamerabetz, and one who sprinkles the floor to prevent the dust, v'harodeh chalot devash, and also one who removes the honeycombs, one who does these things b'shogeg b'Shabbat, inadvertently on Shabbat, chayav chatat, is obligated to bring a chatas offering. Hezid, if the person did these purposefully, biyom tov loke et ha'arba'im, divrei Rabbi Eliezer. If he does it on Yom Tov, he gets malchus. So if he does it on Yom Tov, how much more so is he going to get punished, right? On Shabbos doing it.
Rabbi Green, I thought we learned before that you're allowed to sweep on Shabbos.
Oh, right. Okay. So we're going to see what the Gemara further says to us. Okay, Zeb?
Okay.
But the sages say, Echad ze ve'echad ze eino ela mishum shavut, that this kind of work or that kind of work, okay, in other words, the sweeping and things like that, is basically a derabanan. Okay, it's not the oraita. All right, and therefore one would not get that kind of punishment. Now, Rav Ashi Amar, says Rav Ashi, afilu tema shelo beratzon chachamim. Even if you say that the Kohanim allowed for the water to wash over the floor of the Azara, which was not with the, let's say, the approval of the sages, the Rabbi Natanhi. That's the view of Rabbi Natan. The Tanya, who taught elsewhere in a Braita, Rabbi Natan Omer, Shvut, Tzricha, okay, necessary items that are prohibited rabbinically, hitiru. Shvut she'enat tzricha lo hitiru. But items prohibited rabbinically that were not absolutely necessary, they didn't permit. Okay, so that's our answer, Zev, that apparently sweeping was considered necessary according to some view, even on Shabbat, but on others, they didn't consider it necessary on Shabbat, or sprinkling to keep the dust down, things like that. Okay? Now, what happens? Our Gemara continues and picks up another piece from the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Kos hayam memale v'chule. Rabbi Yehuda was saying, remember that the Kohen would take a cup of the, what we'll call the mixed blood from the floor of the Azara, okay, and ensure that that got sprinkled on the Yesod as well. Tanya, says the Braita, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, says Rabbi Yehuda, Kos hayam memale midam hata'arovot, that the cup was filled with the blood of these mixtures. She'im yishpoch damo shel echad mehen, that if the blood from one of them had spilled out, nimtza zeh machshiro. Nevertheless, it would come and be valid when they sprinkled the blood for atonement or other purposes. Now they responded, Amrulo. They said to Rabbi Yehuda, Vahalo lo nitkabel bekli, but that blood wasn't caught, let's say, by a utensil. Mina yade, how do you know? Says the Gemara. Elahachi ka'amrele. But this is what they said to him. Shema lo nitkabel bekli. Perhaps that blood was not caught, received by a utensil. Amar lehen, and he said back to them, Af ani lo amarti, ela benit kabel bekli. I only said that it was based on the fact that it had been initially received, accepted by a utensil. Mina yada, how does I know this? Kohanim zrizim hein. Why? Because the Kohanim are diligent. So the Gemara says, Izrizin amai mishtapech. If they're so diligent, okay, why then would it overflow? Why would it spill out? Agav zrizutaihu the avde mishtapech. He says, because of their diligence, they're so quick, okay, in passing the container, okay, it's possible that they filled it up to the point that when it got passed, some spilled over out of the utensil. Okay, so the Gemara then says, Vahalo dam hatamtzit mu'urav bo. Okay, but wait a second, if that's blood that's from on the floor, how do we know that that's the life essence blood, the blood that I'm going to say spurted out when it was first
Blood of Shechta,
tested.
right?
Okay, maybe it was the blood instead that dripped out later on. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda l'ta'ameh, but Rabbi Yehuda follows his own reasoning. Excuse me. The Amar dam hatamtzit dam ma'al yahu, that he holds that even the blood that dripped out later is still superior quality blood. In other words, it's like the same as that blood that spurts out at the initial shechita. The Tanya, as he teaches in a Braita, dam hatamtzit ba'azhara, okay? That the one is warned about how to handle the dripping blood and its significance as well. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, okay, and what does he say here? Behi karet, okay, namely that if it's not handled properly, then the punishment is karet. Vahama Rabbi Elazar, but Rabbi Elazar challenges him and said, Mode Rabbi Yehuda le'inyan kapara she'eno mechaper. But Rabbi Yehuda acknowledges that in regards to the fact, the aspect of atonement, that dripping blood, let's call it for the moment, does not bring atonement. Shene Amar, as says in a pasuk, Ki hadam hu banefesh yichaper. The blood, that which is in the life essence, brings atonement. Okay? As we go over to the next Amud, dam shehanefesh yotzah bo mechaper. The blood that exudes from the nefesh, from the life essence, is that which brings atonement. Dam she'ein hanefesh yotzeh bo, blood that doesn't exude from the life essence, eino mechaper, does not bring atonement. So the Gemara tells us, however, Ela Rabbi Yehuda l'ta'ameh, but rather Rabbi Yehuda holds to his own view. The Amar ein dam mevatel dam, that one kind of blood, all right, does not nullify another kind of blood. In other words, it all mixes together in the utensil, right? Whether it's dam tamtzit or not.
So it's all right, the stuff from the floor.
Right? So that's his argument, right?
Right.
Tanya. Now we learn another Braita, a new Braita. Amar lahen Rabbi Yehuda, the Chachamim. He says to the sages the following, Ledivrechem, according to your view then, okay? That you say you don't, let's assume that it's more than just Rabbi Eliezer that disagreed with the rinsing, the washing, the water over the floor of the Azara. Okay? So he challenges them. Okay? According to your view then, Lama Pokakin et Azara. Why do they plug up, okay, the water flow in the Azara? What they do is they have this, I'll call it for a moment a stream, remember, that flows through, okay, and they plug it up. So what do? They basically, when they want to on Shabbat, they would, in this case, unplug it. The water would then flow through, and that's how they would rinse down the floor of the Azara. So they respond to them. Amru, they said to him, Shevachu levnei Aharon, sheyilchu ad arkevotehem badam. It's praiseworthy for the Kohanim that they will pass through, they will walk through, okay, walk on the floor of the Azara with up to their ankles in blood. So the Gemara says, however, Vaha kachayitz, but isn't that an interposition? In other words, doesn't the blood then serve as a block to block between their feet and the floor of the Azara? Okay. Lach hu ve'eno chotzetz, answers the Gemara. The blood is still moist, and therefore it doesn't provide a interposition, a break. Kedetanya, the way we're taught in a Braita, hadam, blood, vahadio, and ink, vahachalav, and milk, vahadvash, and honey. Yeveshim, when they're dry, chotzetzim, they make an interposition. Lachin, when they're still moist, ein chotzetzim, they don't make an interposition. And so the Gemara then raises another challenge. Okay. Vaha kam tavusai ma'anaihu. Okay. Doesn't the blood then soil their garments? Utnan. Okay. And says others, we learn in a Mishnah elsewhere. Hayu bigadav matush tashim. Okay. If it's such that a Kohen's garments are soiled, let's say, va'avad avodato psula, and he carried out the avoda, okay, the sacrificial practice, that avoda is invalid. V'chitema demadlu laho, and if you say that maybe that they could raise their garment, okay, lema'anaihu, okay, in other words, they would lift up the hem, so to speak, of their,
so it doesn't go into the
garment, right? Vahatanya, isn't it taught elsewhere in a Braita? Mido bad, okay, that it has to be from the language of their garment, okay, that exact garment, mido kemidato. In other words, that it has to measure on him, on the Kohen, appropriately. Okay? Shelo yechsar v'lo yatir. That it should not be any shorter, nor be any longer. In other words, the Kohen's garments were made to fit him specifically, right, personally. So the Gemara then tries to explain. B'holechet evarim lekeves. Well, maybe we're talking about when they were bringing the body parts for the offering up to the ramp. The lav avodahi. That's not really part of the sacrificial service. V'lo, and no, asks the Gemara. Vaha medabai kahuna avodahi. But since it's required to be done by the Kohanim, doesn't that make it sacrificial service? The Tanya is taught elsewhere in a Braita. Vehikriv haKohen et hakol hamizbecha. That the Kohen must bring it all to the altar. Zoholachat evarim lekeves. That would include transporting the animal parts for offerings up the ramp. Ela b'holechet eitzim lema'aracha. But rather, maybe we're talking about bringing the wood for the wood pile. The lav avodahi. That's not considered a sacrificial offering act. But the Gemara responds, B'holechet evarim lekeves, in transporting the animal offering parts to the ramp. U'b'holechet dedam, okay, and in bringing the blood, okay, mehecha, okay, hechi azli. And then how did they go? In other words, if they're supposed to still have their feet, again, attached to the floor of the Azara, what's the answer? The misage ha'itz tabe. that they actually walked on platforms. Okay, that maybe they had some of the stones on the floor of the Azara raised up a little bit, okay, and therefore they were still walking on the floor of the Azara. Okay. Now we come back once more to another piece in our Mishnah. Ketzad tolin umafshitin v'chulei kar'u v'hotziu et emorav nitnam b'magis lahaktiram. How did they hang and flay the animals? Okay, and then they cut the insides. They removed the appropriate inner parts, the fats, the kidneys, things like that, that would be burnt on the Mizbeach, and they put it into a bowl in order to get it over to the Mizbeach. So Gemara tells us, Atuhu Gufe Hava Maktir Laho. Since this itself was going to be offered, okay, what was the issue? Ema, I would say, lahaktiran al gav hamizbeach, in order to be able to offer them on the altar. Coming back then, finishing up Yatzta Kat Rishona, that we said that the first group would then leave. Tana is taught in the Braita, Kol echad ve'echad notain pischo be'oro. Okay, so this comes back again, Zev, to that question you asked, all right, the other day, telling us, Braita, that each one then would take after, okay, in other words, a group or a representative of a group, let's say, would come and they would wrap up the remains of the Korban Pesach in the hide of the animal, umafshil la'achorav, and they would sort of throw it over their shoulder, on their back, right, and carry it home. So that's how they brought it back to their own homes, okay, or to the location where they would
Consume it.
do the tzli.
Right.
Amar Rav Elish, says Rav Elish, Taiut. In other words, they did it the way the Arab merchants usually did it. In other words, that's throwing the item over their back and carrying it home. Hadran alach tamid nishchat. And therefore we see that ends the parak of tamid nishchat. Okay.
Rabbi Green.
Yes, sir.
Having once worked in a butcher shop when I was very young, I always was impressed with how red the white aprons got. How could it be that the Kohanim kept their clothes clean with all that blood around? It seemed to be, it would be only a miracle that would keep their...
That's what it was.
That's got to be the answer, Bob.
That's
right?
it.
Okay.
That you have these miracles that occurred frequently in the Beis Hamikdash.
That's right.
Okay, that was one of them.
I can't eat a plate of spaghetti without looking like a wounded warrior.
Okay. All right. All right. Now, since we've discussed, okay, how the Korban Pesach was slaughtered, and then our Mishnah went on to tell us that in general, it was done the same way if the 14th of Nisan came out on Shabbat, as it was done on a weekday. It seems reasonable to ask the question, was it totally the same, or were there certain aspects of the Korban Pesach that were acceptable to be done on Shabbat, even though there might be an issue of potentially being over on Shabbos? Or were there certain aspects that were generally accepted not to be done on Shabbat regarding the Korban Pesach? I'm just going to throw out one example, and then we'll go into the Mishnah. We saw up to now how the Korban Pesach was slaughtered, it was flayed, its internal organs that were required as emurim were offered on the Mizbeach.
Right.
Then they were to bring it home. Does that tell us then that the actual roasting of the animal, okay, could not be done on Shabbat? On a weekday, certainly it could be then brought home, roasted, and one would have it all ready for the meal. But that it implied then that on Shabbat, that was not one of the things that could be done, okay? And therefore one had to wait till after Shabbat then, and then roast the korban for the Seder, okay? So let's go into the Gemara now. I'm sorry, the Mishnah and the Gemara.
If
In
that
a
might
new
mean
part.
if the first day of Pesach was on Shabbos, what would they have wait? If they waited too long, it'd be after the time.
Well, that's a good question, Zev. If they waited too long, you mean if the
They can't wait till after Shabbos anymore because the first day of Yom Tov is Shabbos.
Okay, well, I think they're saying if the 14th of Nisan itself is on Shabbos, okay? In other words, it's not that Yom Tov and Shabbos coincided. It's that as we're going to have this coming the year, okay, that the first Seder is on a Saturday night, right? We know that there are always issues regarding that, right? From past experience, okay? What to do, for example, about the chametz and matzah and all of that. Remember, we're all, okay, familiar with that from a couple years back, okay?
Yeah, we throw it down the toilet.
Well, okay, I don't know how easy that was for them back then, okay? But here our point is, if the 14th of Nisan is on Shabbos, okay? So that's what our Mishnah.
That's the day before Yom Tov.
It's really right. It's Erev Yom Tov.
Right.
Okay. Elu dvarim b'Pesach. These are the things, I'm going to say, in regards to the Korban Pesach, dochin et HaShabbat, that therefore put off, all right, one is not transgressing Shabbat. Shchitato, its slaughter, uzrikat damo, sprinkling of its blood, right? Umechave kra'av, that's the cleaning of the intestines. Vahaktarat chelavav, okay? And the offering of its fats. Aval tzliato, but it's roasting. Okay? Vahadachat kravav, and the, let's say, washing of its inner parts. Einan dochin et HaShabbat. That does not put off, let's say, defer Shabbat. Furthermore, says now the Mishnah, har kavto, carrying it home, v'hava'ato michutz l'tchum, and bringing the animal from outside the Shabbos boundary, v'chatichat yevalto, okay, and cutting it up, right? Ein dochin et HaShabbat. Okay, that also does not seem to be putting off Shabbat. Okay, so in other words, certain cuts, right? Now, Rabbi Eliezer, Omer Dochin. Rabbi Eliezer says it does put off, these do put off the Shabbat. We'll have to see. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, V'halo dinhu. Doesn't this seem logical, he says. Ma'im shchita, shehi mishum melacha dochet HaShabbat. Since the slaughter of the animal puts off the Shabbat, right? Elu, these other items, shehein mishum shavut, that they are sort of only shavut, rabbinic prohibitions, lo yidchu et Shabbat, shouldn't they also put off Shabbat? Amar le Rabbi Yoshua. Says Rabbi Yoshua, Yom Tov Yochiach. The issue of the holiday itself can prove Shehitiru bo mishum malacha, that there are aspects by which we permit certain kinds of work, va'asur bo mishum shvut. But there are other aspects which are forbidden because of shvut, because of rabbinic prohibitions. Amar le Rabbi Eliezer, ma zeh Yehoshua. So he challenges him, Yoshua, what are you referring to? What kind of proof is that? Ma ra'ayat reshut l'mitzvah. Okay, what are you talking about? Okay, what kind of citation is that when it regards to the fact that it's permitted because of the act of doing a mitzvah? Heshiv Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva comes now to join this discussion. Okay, and he comes to the, let's say, to the defense for the moment of Rabbi Yoshua. Va'amar, he says, haza'at tochiach. I'll take the example of the sprinkling as proof. Shehi mishum mitzvah, that is a clear example of a mitzvah. Vehi mishum shvut, but it's also an issue of a rabbinic issue, rabbinic prohibition issue, right? Ve'ena dochet Shabbat, but it does not put off Shabbat. Afata al titma al elo, and you shouldn't be so surprised about this, he says. She'af al pi shehein mishum mitzvah, because even though they are a mitzvah, vehein mishum shavut, and they are also rabbinic prohibitions, limits, lo yidchu et Shabbat, that they don't put off Shabbat. Now, amar lo Rabbi Eliezer. So Rabbi Eliezer then responds, Va'alei anidan. And on these, that's what I'm discussing, and I'm focusing on, and I'm trying to reason. Uma im shchita shehi mishum malacha dochet haShabbat, whereas we see that shchita, slaughtering of the animal, okay, is something, okay, that is a clear malacha, okay. In other words, it's an isur doraita normally, and yet it still puts off Shabbat. Haza'ah shehi mishum shavut, sprinkling, okay, which is clearly only a rabbinic prohibition. Eino din shedochet haShabbat. Is it not reasonable that it should not also put off Shabbat? Okay. Now, tomorrow we'll pick up on Samech Vav, where we see that Rabbi Akiva is going to challenge that answer of Rabbi Eliezer once again, okay, and go into this in more detail. So that's why I stopped here, okay. I know we could have theoretically gone through the rest of the Mishnah, but I think it'll be helpful tomorrow to connect this latter part of the Mishnah before we go into the Gemara. Okay? So we'll stop there today and pick up on the top of Samech Vav tomorrow. Okay? So everybody have a good day, take care, and stay well.
Same to you.